cancer originates from normal cells. So in other words, they're not just something like a virus that just comes from something external. It comes from within. In other words, there's something that happens in your environment that creates destruction of a part of your cell called the mitochondria.
If you eat bad food and junk food and ultra-processed food, you are going to be silencing something called the tumor suppressor genes. Genes that suppress cancer. Or, even worse, you're going to be activating genes that cause cancer, called oncogenes. Oncology is cancer. Oncogenes are cancer-causing genes. These are genetic mutations that turn on tumors, and it's caused by what we're eating. Over 10,000 chemicals are allowed in the food we eat in the United States. 10,000. And here's what's shocking. 99% of the food chemicals that have been introduced to our food supply since 2000 were approved not by the government, not by the FDA, but approved by the food and chemical companies that made them.
And if an ingredient list looks like this, then it's absolutely not something that you want to consume. But here's the scariest part, that we have all this food. We have a culture where there's thousands of products with ingredient lists like this, and then they try to help you understand this food by giving you something called nutrition facts. And the only thing that you get really to evaluate whether this is good or bad is how many calories does it have.
Welcome back to Natural Health KE, where we share information about the link between your health and nutrition and lifestyle. In today's video, we are talking about cancer. Cancer is a leading cause of death worldwide, accounting for nearly 10 million deaths in 2022, or nearly 1 in 6 deaths. The most common cancers are breast, lung, colon and rectum, and prostate cancers. According to the World Health Organization, cancer cases are expected to rise by 47% between 2020 and 2040. Approximately 40.5% of men and women will be diagnosed with cancer at some point during their lifetime. While cancer mortality rates are declining due to improved and targeted treatment options, no one is addressing the reason why cancer rates are still on the rise. In this video, we will break down what causes cancer and how it develops in the body. We will also get insights from Dr. Berg, Dr. Eckberg, and Dr. Hyman on the connection between diet and cancer, and how you can take control of your health with nutrition to reduce your risk. Let's begin with Dr. Eckberg, a holistic medical practitioner, explaining about the causes of cancer.
But the number one thing we have to understand about these things is when we talk about cancer-fighting foods or the best foods for this or that, most people start thinking with a pill mentality. They think they're going to find that superfood that's going to go in and strike out all the evil and all the bad in the body. But it doesn't work like that, because first we have to realize that there are certain things causing the cancer. And unless we stop putting those factors in, there's nothing else we can do to make it better. So the first thing we have to do is to avoid all of the different factors that give the cancer the upper hand. And then we want to go in and figure out what are some really good foods, what are some categories, some types of food that can help the body, that can strengthen the body, that can strengthen the immune system, etc., and that might be able to offset or compensate for some of these factors. So the Warburg effect is basically observing that cancer cells prefer glucose. They're different than your normal cells. They come from your body's own cells, but they have changed. And in that changing, now they behave differently and they prefer different fuels. So there's basically two ways that a cell can make energy, whether it's a normal body cell or whether it's a cancer cell. And the first way is called glycolysis, and the other way is called OXPHOS, or oxidative phosphorylation. That's where we make ATP from ADP. Oxidative phosphorylation, with oxygen, it's more efficient. We can get more energy made. But with glycolysis, we can do it faster. And that's what the cancer cell really loves, because the cancer is not well behaved. It's gone rogue. It tries to grow as fast as possible, and that's why it prefers the glycolysis. And now if we load up the system with glucose and we have really high blood sugar all the time, now we're feeding the cancer cells, we're giving them their favorite fuel, which allows very rapid growth. But what that also means is that the worse the cancer is, the more aggressive, the more malignant, the more fast-growing that cancer is, the more sugar-loving it is, the more it's going to depend on that sugar. And that's how they diagnose these things with imaging. They feed them sugar and they see where they light up on the screen, because the most aggressive cells are going to be absorbing the most glucose and grow the fastest.
We've heard from Dr. Eckberg about the Warburg effect, named after German Nobel laureate Otto Warburg, who made his discovery almost a century ago. This discovery marked a significant step in understanding cancer cell metabolism. Warburg effect is now used to describe this metabolic switch in cancer cells. Before we delve further into the Warburg effect, what does holistic medical practitioner Dr. Berg have to say about this metabolic switch in cancer cells?
Cancer originates from normal cells. So in other words, they're not just something like a virus that just comes from something external. It comes from within. In other words, there's something that happens in your environment that creates destruction of a part of your cell called the mitochondria. And because the mitochondria has one really important function of producing energy for your body, when that cell no longer gets the energy, it has a backup program. So cancer really is an adaptation to a different energy source, because the mitochondria is no longer providing energy. The actual source of mitochondria in our cells really originated from a bacteria. In other words, the mitochondria has all the properties of some bacteria that long ago came into our cells, and somehow there was an agreement that it would work together and it would provide a certain function in the cell, which is producing energy and many other things. And the cell would provide a home to the mitochondria. And apparently one of the ancient programs in the mitochondria was this type of energy system. When there seems to be a lot of stress or damage within this system, it converts over to that system, and we call that cancer. Normally, the cell uses this type of metabolism to get its energy. When it converts over into a cancer, it uses this type of energy right here. Cancer's metabolism is a different type of metabolism. Mitochondria is really the pivot point between health and disease. And when the mitochondria becomes damaged and that cell turns into a cancer cell, some interesting things occur. First of all, that cancer cell becomes immortal. So it loses any type of program to die. The cancer cell also produces inflammation, and it seems to grow and spread into areas of inflammation, including old injuries. The other unique thing about when this normal cell turns into a cancer cell is it now has a certain advantage where it can resist death, okay? Because normally our cells, when they become damaged, they go through this thing called apoptosis, where they commit suicide and they take themselves out, but not cancer cells. They resist this apoptosis. They resist also the growth of tumor suppressor cells. So in our bodies, we have the ability to suppress tumors. Apparently, cancer resists that. So that's kind of a survival mechanism. It also counters the immune attack on itself. So I wanted to give you a little background, because in order to reduce your risk of getting cancer, it's really about reducing your risk of developing damage to the mitochondria.
Let's break down the Warburg effect a little further. Cancer cells love sugar because it gives them fast fuel to grow and spread. But here's the problem. They don't use sugar efficiently. How do they work? Normal cells use a power plant system, that is mitochondria, to turn sugar into a lot of energy using oxygen. Cancer cells, on the other hand, skip the power plant and rely on a quick but wasteful method called glycolysis, even when oxygen is available. Why is this a problem? First, it leads to low energy output. Cancer cells make only 2 ATP, that is, energy units, per glucose, compared to 36 ATP in normal cells. This means they burn through sugar very fast. Then one experiences more sugar cravings because they need more and more fuel, Cancer cells drive sugar cravings to keep feeding themselves. Another problem is the issue of toxic waste buildup. Instead of clean energy, they produce lactic acid, which makes the body more acidic, weakens the immune system, and helps cancer spread.
And if we understand that Warburg effect, now it becomes rather obvious what kind of foods to eat if we want to starve a cancer. So that's obviously low carb, or for some people, even a ketogenic diet. Avocado, for example, leafy greens, non-starchy vegetables, extra virgin olive oil, butter, coconut oil. These are all healthy fats that don't raise blood sugar at all. Other low-carb foods are things like meat, fish, and chicken, and we should always try to get those from natural sources. So grass-fed meat, wild-caught fish, and pastured chicken, if we can get it, is always going to be better. Then nuts and seeds are low-carb, high-fiber. They don't raise blood glucose much at all. Mushrooms are a good example. And then we also want to realize that when I give you a list, that doesn't necessarily mean that these are the only foods or the only good foods. We need to understand, what do these have in common, and realize that there are many other similar foods. So basically any real food that is similar is going to work really well. And then we also want to realize that even though these foods are selected to accommodate for the Warburg effect, to starve a cancer cell because it likes sugar, a lot of these foods, if they're real food, they're also going to satisfy these other criteria. They're going to reduce or be neutral to chronic inflammation, to carcinogens and chemicals, to oxidative stress, to immune system, to hormonal balance, and to gut health. And this is very, very different from an isolated chemical or an isolated vitamin that might account for one of these. It might fit into one category or improve one thing, like a medication, but it's not going to fit into multiple. It's not going to create a complete holistic picture the way that whole food will.
Next, we are going to look at inflammation. What role does inflammation play in cancer? Listen closely to what Dr. Hyman has to say on this issue.
Development and the progression of cancer, it happens downstream of chronic low-grade inflammation. So how does that work? Well, how does chronic inflammation drive cancer? Well, it creates a microenvironment that supports tumor development, tumor growth, and tumor progression. In other words, metastasis. Inflammatory mediators, things like cytokines, they promote DNA damage. They inhibit something called apoptosis, which is basically programmed cell death, getting rid of damaged cells. So it stops the process of actually getting rid of all the cells that are going to turn to cancer. It also enhances angiogenesis, which is the formation of new blood vessels that supply tumors with blood and nutrients for growth, which they need, otherwise they die if they have no blood supply. Inflammation processes can also cause changes to your DNA through something called epigenetic modifications. If you eat bad food and junk food and ultra-processed food, you are going to be silencing something called the tumor suppressor genes. Genes that suppress cancer. Or even worse, you're going to be activating genes that cause cancer, called oncogenes. Oncology is cancer. Oncogenes are cancer-causing genes. These are genetic mutations that turn on tumors, and it's caused by what we're eating.
And since inflammation is a driving factor for cancer, we want to eat foods that lower inflammation, or at the very least are neutral. So that would include all low-carb foods again, because if we eat high carb and we become insulin resistant, that is a driving factor for inflammation. But then there are other natural foods and compounds in garlic, in turmeric, in ginger that can actually have a natural anti-inflammatory effect. Another good thing is berries. They contain things like anthocyanins. And then we have things like fatty fish. Even they're high in omega-3, then they have a normalizing effect on inflammatory responses. It's not like a pill that you take that's anti-inflammatory, but it helps the body modulate and balance out to appropriate inflammatory responses. Another example is broccoli. Contains something called sulforaphane, and in dark chocolate we have things like flavonoids. Extra virgin olive oil and olives have something called oleocanthal. And again, I've given you a few examples here, but realize that there are also many other real foods that will be beneficial and contain many similar things. And even though we're talking mostly about the inflammation component here, the chronic inflammation, a lot of these foods will actually help in all of these different categories. And then we have carcinogens and chemicals that the body has to detox. And who does that? Well, primarily the liver. So if the liver is overburdened from other things like sugar and alcohol, that's not so great. So we want to cut those out first. And then we want to think liver support. What is it that helps the liver? Low carb, low sugar, because those things create a fatty liver that's a burden on the liver. We have cruciferous vegetables with something called glucosinolates. We have tomatoes with lycopene. And these are different compounds that assist the liver in its detoxification pathways. In the leek family, like garlic, we have sulfur compounds that also assist the liver. And then we have eggs that contain choline, which is a very important nutrient for the liver to perform some of its metabolic processes. And then I hope you're starting to see the pattern, and many other whole foods, many other real foods are going to be very similar to this. So if we start understanding and seeing patterns, then we're not limited to certain foods, and we stop thinking about them as magic pills or magic bullets. And again, we focused on carcinogen detox, detoxifying chemicals that can be harmful. But if they're whole foods, then they will probably assist us in many other ways also. And foods can be immune boosting. So garlic, ginger are very well known as immune boosters. They are antibacterial in themselves. So if you have an immune challenge, they can actually kill off some things on their own, like a natural antibiotic. But they can also help with immunomodulation, with balancing and stimulating and making the immune system behave right. And they can also boost the production of white blood cells, which are your immune fighting cells. Another example is mushrooms. They contain something called beta-glucans, and that can have an immune stimulating effect, stimulate immune function. And bell pepper contains vitamin C, which is also a necessary component for the immune system. And a lot of times people will talk about citrus fruit, and especially orange juice, and they start gobbling up orange juice by the gallon as if that was the only thing that had vitamin C. Well, bell pepper actually has more vitamin C than citrus fruit, but it has a fraction of the sugar. So again, we don't want to just take something that could be good if it also contains something that's going to counteract that. And again, even though I'm mentioning certain compounds that are contained in these foods, there are also going to be many other whole real foods that contain these or similar compounds. And again, we're focusing on the immune portion, but if these foods are natural and whole and alive and fresh, then they're going to assist us on many different areas. Now, what about hormone balance? What does that have to do with it? Well, it's two hormones primarily that are associated with driving cancer, and that is estrogen and insulin. And with estrogen, of course, it's primarily females and breast cancer, but there are some other cancers as well. But the thing we need to know here is that insulin is the primary factor. So if we have high levels of insulin, if we're insulin resistant, that's the primary factor that's going to dysregulate, that's going to unbalance estrogen. So the very first thing we need to do is to make sure that our insulin levels are okay. So again, we want to eat a low carb or a moderate carb diet, especially if you're insulin resistant. So the more insulin resistant you are, the less carbs you want to eat. And broccoli shows up again. It has something called indole-3-carbinol that has been shown to help balance out estrogen levels. And what's important both for inflammation and hormone regulation is that we have a lot of healthy fats. So fatty fish that are high in omega-3s, and then extra virgin olive oil, avocado that are high in monounsaturated fats that are very neutral to inflammation, can be very helpful for the body to perform a lot of its functions. And now you're starting to catch on. You know that there are many other real foods that will be similar to these that can also help you in all these different areas. And then we want to choose foods to reduce oxidation and oxidative stress. So there are foods that contain natural antioxidants, and those are the ones that we want to make sure we get plenty of. But it doesn't mean that more antioxidants is always better, like some people think, and then they run to the store and they buy these mega dose synthetic antioxidants. That's not a good idea, because oxidation is what gives us energy. When we eat food and we turn it into energy, we oxidize that food. We produce oxygen and free radicals, and then we need these natural antioxidants to neutralize the free radicals. But it is totally possible to eat a bunch of these megadose synthetic antioxidants and interfere with energy production. And they've done long-term studies where they find that the people who eat the most synthetic antioxidants live the shortest. It actually takes years off your lifespan, because that's not the way we want to go about it. We want to get things that are natural, that help the body balance it out naturally, not mega doses that go in and interfere and flatten what the body is trying to do. And these natural antioxidants we can find in berries, in dark chocolate, green tea, turmeric, tomatoes, pomegranate are all very rich sources. And you're going to find some of these antioxidants in virtually every type of plant. So there's a wide variety of plants, as well as many other real foods that will help you get these benefits and that can assist you with all of these different risk factors and mechanisms for cancer. And then there is gut health that is tied to immune function. Your immune system is heavily dependent on what happens in the gut. Your inflammatory responses, your inflammatory regulation, your allergies, autoimmune responses depend on what's happening in the gut, how healthy and intact that is. And also your hormone balance, because a lot of stuff going on in the gut can affect your hormone signaling. So in other words, poor gut health leads to disease.
Did you know that your gut health affects trillions of bacteria that control your digestion, your physical health, mental health? Also, a healthy gut equals a strong defense against cancer. Eating unhealthy foods, such as junk food, leads to poor gut health. Let's understand how.
Cancer rates are on the rise.
Did you know that your
especially
gut
among young
health
people,
affects trillions
and
of bacteria
understanding
that
the
control your
connection between
digestion,
what we eat
your physical health,
and our risk for
mental
this
health?
disease is more important.
Also, a healthy gut
How does
equals a
this
strong
standard
defense
American
against
diet,
cancer.
the SAD diet,
Let's understand
disrupt
how.
our gut microbiome? Well, it's because it's so rich in bad stuff, like ultra-processed foods, which are energy dense, but they contain a lot of other stuff, like added sugars, sweeteners, refined grains, bad fats, toxins, actual literal toxins, chemical additives, preservatives, PFAS, phthalates, things that are just poisons that damage the gut. Now, this feeds and grows the bad bacteria, and it reduces something called bacterial diversity. You want an ecosystem like a rainforest, complex, diverse, resilient. You don't want a monocrop cornfield that can go out just like that with some adversity. And we are having a low bacterial diversity in our modern world. Hippocrates once said that all disease begins in the gut. And for the purpose of this conversation, we're going to follow his advice and start in the gut. So how do imbalances in your gut microbiome lead to cancer? Healthy gut contains a whole diverse population of bugs, of microorganisms that play key roles in your digestion, in a nutrient absorption, and your immune function. Why? Because 60% of your immune system lives in your gut. It's right underneath the lining of your gut. Why? Because you're exposed to the outside world and it's trying to protect you from all the bad stuff inside your gut, which is poop and food. Now, good gut bacteria make something called postbiotics. You've heard of prebiotics like fiber, or probiotics like lactobacillus, but there's something called postbiotics. These are molecules, metabolites of bacteria in your gut. And they can be good or bad. So they're called postbiotics, and they're made by what you're eating and feeding the bacteria in your gut. Now, there's a lot of them, but some of them are really important in regulating cancer. For example, butyrate is a anti-cancer compound made by your microbiome when you have good bugs in there. You also make other compounds like acetate and propionate. These are metabolites that are produced by bacterial fermentation of fiber and all the polyphenols, all those colorful compounds in veggies and fruits that supports the integrity of the gut lining. And the gut lining is so important because without a healthy gut lining, basically all that poop and food is leaking into your bloodstream and causing your immune system to go crazy. Now, these metabolites, they're called short-chain fatty acids. They have anti-cancer properties. They regulate our immune system. They help fight inflammation. And when there's a good balance of these microorganisms, that's great. But when that balance is disrupted, it leads to an overgrowth of the bad bacteria and a reduction in the beneficial bacteria. So it's like getting weeds in your garden. The good plants, they get crowded out by the bad weeds, right? And bad bacteria are bad because they release poisons, toxins. We call them endotoxins. That just means an internal toxin. And those endotoxins get into your system through a leaky gut, and they also cause a leaky gut, and they cause inflammation. And the imbalances in your gut microbiome that cause this problem is called dysbiosis. Now, dysbiosis can compromise the integrity of the gut lining. It makes you have a leaky gut and leads to something called increased intestinal permeability, and the basic lay term is leaky gut. Now, basically, think about your gut as one cell lining that protects you from the outside world. And the cells are stuck together like Legos. They have something called tight junctions. When those are damaged, which happens because of bad gut bacteria and all our processed food and emulsifiers and additives and all this crap, you separate these cells, and then the food and bacteria can leak in between the cells and get into your bloodstream, and then right underneath your gut lining is your immune system. So that's why this is such a big deal. And when you have this leaky gut, it allows toxins and undigested food particles and pathogens, bacteria to enter the bloodstream, and your body's like, wow, this is not me. That leads to an overactive immune system and chronic inflammation throughout the body. It affects everything.
Did you know that your gut health affects trillions of bacteria that control your digestion, your physical health, mental health? Also, a healthy gut equals a strong defense against cancer. Let's understand how.
But one of the first things that you want to have is fermented foods or probiotic foods. And these are foods that contain bacteria that are good for your gut or supposed to be good for your gut. And some of them can colonize and set up shop and help balance things out. And others just kind of pass through. But in doing that, they outcompete some of the bad bacteria. They provide a competitive environment and keep some of the others down. And some foods here are examples like sauerkraut and kimchi and yogurt and kefir. And you could ferment lots and lots of different types of food. And then you have prebiotic foods. The first category is probiotic. That's the actual bacteria or spore. But the prebiotic, that's the stuff that feeds the probiotic. It acts as food for them. And here we have things like asparagus and onion, garlic, and leek. They contain a lot of something called inulin or FOS, fructooligosaccharides. And we also have leafy greens that contain certain types of fiber and also a lot of polyphenols. Also cruciferous vegetables like broccoli, cauliflower, kale, Brussels sprouts, and cabbage. They also have lots of good compounds. They have some fiber, but also some other compounds that can selectively feed and create a good variety in your gut. And if you haven't figured it out yet, in addition to these foods I mentioned, there are many other good real foods as well. So don't limit yourself to this. And even though these are a little special in some ways, they're not unique. They're not the only ones that you want to eat. But I started off saying that while it's important what you eat, it's even more important what you don't eat. So let's compare and contrast a little bit on these 7 different mechanisms that create cancer and see what processed food does for them. So first, we have high sugar and white flour. In processed foods, they're going to be primarily made from sugar and white flour. And of course, that's going to raise blood sugar. So immediately, we are violating the principle of not feeding the cancer. But then we also need to understand that long-term intake of sugar and white flour is going to drive chronic inflammation. It's going to be the most common mechanism in driving insulin resistance and chronic inflammation. So now we immediately knock out the second principle of chronic inflammation. We violate that. But this processed food that's high in that stuff is also going to create a lot of oxidative stress. So again, a strike for oxidative stress here. And then these processed foods are also going to contain a lot of chemicals. They're going to have artificial sweeteners, artificial flavorings, artificial colors. You're going to have pesticides and stabilizers and preservatives, etc. And not only are some of these going to be carcinogenic, and maybe we don't find out for another few years, but a lot of things that are used in some countries are banned in other countries. But also, these chemicals will create oxidative stress and inflammation. So again, it doesn't just affect one thing. Something that's really bad can strike out lots and lots of different things. So now already we have 4 out of 7 things here with a strike. And then it works the other way. So all 4 of these things are going to work the other way and create an immune system compromise. There's going to be an additional burden on your immune system. So we get a big red X on immunity as well from processed foods. So how is processed foods for hormones? Well, we know that sugar and white flour is going to drive blood sugar and insulin resistance, and that insulin is going to dysregulate estrogen like we talked about. But also, a lot of these chemicals that they add to food are going to act as endocrine disruptors. And that means that they're going to unbalance your hormone system. A lot of these chemicals, the molecules are going to have a shape and size that's similar to a hormone, and it's going to fit into the same receptor and confuse the body. So it's going to block something and stimulate it, or it's going to fit into it and stop it. So you get too much or not enough of something because of this endocrine dysregulation. So processed food is pretty good at messing up your hormone system too. So what about gut health? What does processed food do for that? Well, once we understand how closely tied gut health is to all of these different factors, and we see now, I put some arrows that are mostly going both directions, meaning that these things, these mechanisms will cause dysbiosis, will cause an imbalance, will cause a pathogenic overgrowth, will dysregulate your biome, but then that unbalanced gut will further create more problems, will worsen all of these different things. So it's like a vicious cycle that just keeps going. Then I hope you start realizing that processed food is just not such a good idea, that 90% of what you eat should be something other than processed foods. When we mess with it, when we add chemicals, when we repackage it, then it just doesn't work like food anymore.
Over 10,000 chemicals are allowed in the food we eat in the United States. 10,000. And here's what's shocking. 99% of the food chemicals that have been introduced to our food supply since 2000 were approved not by the government, not by the FDA, but approved by the food and chemical companies that made them. Avoid processed and packaged foods. All that BPA is in the plastics and the cans and the packaging. Phthalates, the forever chemicals, PFAS, microplastics that leach into our food from packaging, from the manufacturing processes. It's in our water and our soil. Make sure you filter your water.
And if an ingredient list looks like this, then it's absolutely not something that you want to consume. But here's the scariest part, that we have all this food. We have a culture where there's thousands of products with ingredient lists like this, and then they try to help you understand this food by giving you something called nutrition facts. And the only thing that you get really to evaluate whether this is good or bad is how many calories does it have. And that all 7 of the different mechanisms that cause cancer are heavily influenced by all these different factors and these different chemicals. And then we get a label where we try to understand this based on calories and a few different grams. This label does not tell the story. So learn to understand what real food is and eat almost exclusively real food.
There you have it. To reduce your cancer risk, start adjusting your diet today and add more real food onto your plate. Our suggestion is that you do this gradually so that this is not too overwhelming. Please share in the comments section below how you plan to start. If this video is helpful, please like and subscribe to our channel, and do not forget to hit the notification button so that you can be alerted when we release a new video.